Sorry to be late. Honestly, we are doing the very best we can. It's good to be here at all. And hopefully we'll have enough time for a profitable session in the book of Acts. Last time we spent our whole session on verse 18 of chapter 11. So we'll try to move on and discuss some details about the church in Antioch, beginning in verses 19 and following. And I ask for class participation as you have questions. Hopefully you'll have questions or comments to make, application, clarification, or things of that nature. We'll be happy to field those and welcome those. Now the text says, "Now those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews." So the church has not yet fully learned the lesson. This is all they knew to do anyway. This was their modus operandi. They went from synagogue to synagogue, of course. And yet it's not exclusively that. There were some, verse 20, of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene, who on coming to Antioch spoke to the Hellenists also, preaching the Lord Jesus. So this seems to indicate they're going to Jews of a Greek culture and a Greek language background. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord. One of the things we have to notice about statements like this, we can pass over them lightly if we're not careful, is that there in biblical usage is a difference, and it's an important one, between the mere act of assenting to a proposition as true, accepting it by faith in that sense, belief in that generic sense, or that specific sense, I should say. It's a very narrow, specific sense. And turning to the Lord. Here, turning to the Lord is an act subsequent to believing, so they're not the same. You haven't turned to the Lord when you believe. You have to believe in order to turn to the Lord. And until you turn to the Lord, you cannot go to heaven. That's the point.
Well, it's just weird that, they'd be talking to the Jews only, and they'd be turning to the Lord. I mean, isn't it really not necessary to become a Christian? I mean, can't you just be a Jew?
Well, according to theories today, that's a good point. Throughout the narrative before us in Acts, Luke simply didn't share that point of view, even though he himself was no doubt a Hellenist Jew, but he didn't have that idea. He saw there's one gospel, and it's for all, both Jew and Gentile, one message, one plan. That's the way it will be until the end of time. That's the way it was from the moment of the cross. But you're right, people today distort that teaching. But here it says that they believed and then they turned to the Lord. So obviously the act of turning comes subsequent to believing. Turn to the Lord. This is what in the King James would be translated as convert or conversion. And the idea was very popular at one time. Still, we use that term regularly, conversion, be converted. In days gone by, well, the word itself is harmless enough. It just means to change. It means to turn. That's a good synonym. That's a simple synonym. Turn to the Lord. This is what conversion is. Conversion, convert, change. Not this, now it's that. You turn to the Lord. But in the past, and especially because of the influence of King James translators, and I'm not saying this in any way to be hypercritical of the King James. It's still a wonderful, stately, classic translation. And I've memorized most of what little I know, out of the King James. I'll probably use it the rest of my days. And yet we have to admit the facts of history. A large number of the translators on the committee, of over 70, were dyed-in-the-wool Calvinists. And their Calvinism got in the way sometimes of their scholarship. So they would use terms like be converted in a passive way, when in reality, the idea grammatically is active. Convert. Convert, turn to the Lord. So instead of saying be converted, which in the Calvinist point of view means God did it to you. God made you become one of his own. You were elect. In the New Testament outlook is really you turn. It's free will on the part of the individual to make the choice to turn. So again, my point is this, just one more small nail in the big coffin that would destroy Reformed theology and its false plan of salvation by faith only, sola fide. Because if they were already saved, that means they were already turned to the Lord. They would have already been with the Lord if they were saved at the point of faith alone. But they have to do something subsequent to after the act of believing. Turning is subsequent to that. And it would include repentance, confession, and baptism, no doubt. So in verse 22, the report of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. Now think about this. Today, there's a lot of friction between these two parts of the world. You have Jerusalem, which, it's Muslimized to the hilt, but it also is now officially part of Israel, at least big chunks of the city. And then you have up there in Syria, where Antioch was. And you have, of course, Syria, is thought of as Arab, thought of as Muslim today. But in those days, it was different. You had a large contingency of people who were of the Jewish persuasion already living in Antioch, and even Hellenistic Jews. The hand of the Lord was with them. Great number turned to the Lord. The report of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas and Antioch. Now, this is not the only time we see this. When they learn about the good results at Samaria, then Peter and John go over to Samaria to do some work there. So it shows that they were keenly interested in mission work that was going on outside the confines of Judea, or the city of Jerusalem in particular. They wanted to know what's happening elsewhere, and they were delighted to learn this. So they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he came and saw the grace of God, he was glad. So now what could this mean? What had Luke just narrated took place there? Well, preachers went. They preached. People heard it, no doubt. That's how this came about. And they believed the preaching, right? What did they preach? I think we have a pretty good idea. It would have been the gospel message, the message of the cross, the message of Jesus. So they preached it. People among these Hellenist Jews heard it, and they accepted it. They believed it. And then when they believed it, they turned to the Lord. They became Christians. And this is called here the grace of God. Are the Calvinists right after all? Have we just missed it? Calvinists don't have any kind of monopoly on the idea of grace. That's a biblical teaching. We're not going to let them wrest it from us and take it away out of its proper context. This is the grace of God in action here. We'll have more to say about that in the next hour, the Lord willing. But let me just mention now, this is the gospel in action. This is how God does it. This is how his grace is shown. So he saw the grace of God among these people. They were being saved by the grace of God. How? They heard the gospel, believed it, and they turned to the Lord. They obeyed him. He was glad, and he exhorted them all to be glad you got saved once because you can never lose it. No, that's not what he said. I'm being facetious. That's what a Baptist preacher would say today. Charles Stanley or someone of that ilk, if he were with us. That's what they would say. Aren't you glad you got it? Let me give you a words of comfort here. You can never lose it, so no matter what you do, Bubba, you'll always have it. No, he exhorted them to remain faithful to the Lord. There's a purpose for that, and there's a steadfast purpose they should have as they do it. They should be steadfast. 1 Corinthians 15:58. Be immovable, steadfast, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because our work in the Lord is not in vain. For he was a good man. Who was a good man? Who are we talking about here in the narrative? Barnabas. Exactly. He was a good man. Now, aren't they all? I mean, they're all preachers, right? Can you say some seem to be good people, and that's the first characteristic that you see in them before anything else? It doesn't say necessarily he was a great debater. I'm sure he could hold his own. He knew the truth. But that's not the emphasis, or an eloquent preacher, or mighty in the scriptures. It just says he's a good man. I've known people in the brotherhood like that. I would consider them as good. Now, this is not in any way to say that those that I wouldn't mention as first on the list would not qualify, But I'm thinking of the late Gus Nichols. Some of you remember Brother Nichols. I remember hearing him as a young man. He'd hold meetings at Bremen, for example, and we'd hear him there. He'd preach 2.5, 3 hours from Walker County, Alabama, Jasper area, well known throughout the world, throughout the brotherhood, in particular in the South, well, just about anywhere in the United States. And he held many debates. He was just a great meeting preacher. But there was something about Brother Nichols that everybody saw. It struck them. It was not that he had such a keen mind, and he did. He had a very keen mind. It was that he just seemed like a good guy. You know, when you're around, you thought, this guy is genuine. When he tells you he likes you and he shakes your hand and smiles, he means it. You know, he's sincere. It's not an act. He's not just going through the motions. You know what I mean? And this is not to say that everybody else is a hypocrite. It's just to say there were some few people who influenced me when I was growing up, as Brother Gus Nichols, who came across that way, and still to this day I remember them as being good. If you read his debates he held with a number of people, they're written debates. Some of them are recorded, but if you have access to the written debates, it comes out even in the language. The man used pathos and respect and kindness toward his opponents. Now, some of our brethren were hard-hitting. They did good work. I'm thinking Brother Foy Wallace Jr. out in Texas. He had a really sharp mind, really sharp. And I mean sharp, cutting mind. And in a debate, he could rip his opponent to shreds in 5 seconds. Just rip them to shreds. And he was not a bad man. I'm not meaning that Brother Wallace was, not good, but I'm just saying, you think of him as being a competent man, a great debater, very knowledgeable. And you also think of Brother Nichols as being knowledgeable, but he was good. I don't know if I can get that across as I say. He was a good guy. You just knew that about him. And he was influential in debates because his opponents in the debates recognized that. And they found it hard to be mean and ugly. Some of them were. But they found it very hard to be very mean to him in the debate. So he kept the debates at a high level, high tone, not a bunch of mudslinging going on. Anyway, I'm thinking of that, and I believe that's what the Holy Spirit has in mind when he has Luke to tell us that Barnabas was a good man. He goes on to add that he was full of the Holy Spirit and faith. So I think here, this expression, full of the Holy Spirit, since all Christians, by virtue of being children of God, have a measure of the Spirit, that what we call the ordinary gift, Acts 2:38, saying he's full of the Spirit would seem to indicate that he had had an apostle to lay hands upon him, and that from that he had derived the gift of the Spirit miraculously. So he's going up there to help teach them because he's a prophet in the early church. He's a man of faith too. And a great many people were added to the Lord. I'd forgotten about this one, and here it is in chapter 11. I was going to mention some things later in the earlier chapter. You find in the earlier chapters, Luke has already dealt with that quite a bit, about the number who turned to the Lord. So they were added to the Lord. A great many people were added to the Lord. Well, wait. In Acts 2:47, in the King James, it says they were added to the church, such as were being saved. Literally in the Greek, it says they were added together, such as were being saved. So it's the same idea here. Added to what? Well, a group added together. And we know that group from other considerations to be the Church of Christ. So Barnabas went to Tarsus. Now think that's over in Turkey now, Asia Minor, to look for Saul. Remember, Saul's a new convert, relatively speaking. He's kind of shuffled out of the way a little bit because he's controversial. He used to be that great persecutor. Now he's in the church and people sort of fear him, but he goes up there and he's doing a good work in Tarsus, in the area around where he was raised. So he goes there to look for him because he knows he's there. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. See, that's not that terribly far over. See, I'm not going over from Turkey into Syria. You can think of a map today where geographically that's not a great distance. For a whole year, they met with the church and taught a great many people. Now, this is just one consideration we've often derived from this. I think the inference is fair when it says for a whole year they met with the church. I would suspect they were not bouncing from congregation to congregation. If they had that luxury, if there were several congregations there, but that they stayed with a congregation and they put their shoulder to the wheel, you would say. They worked with that church and they taught a great many people. They taught a great many people. That's a recurring theme throughout Acts. It's just almost every page. A lot of people are being taught. And what else is happening? A lot of people are being added to the Lord. One-to-one correspondence nearly, is there not, between doing a lot of teaching and having a lot of additions. So, and in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. So, the disciples, there's a proper phrase to describe the earlier followers of Jesus. Disciple is a follower, student, learner. And they were called Christians here. Now, obviously, from that point forward, in other places, they would continue to be called Christians. This name would stick. The issue is, for many, who did the calling? Who first called them that? Was this a derisive term? Often today, it is alleged that their opponents said, you are Christians, belonging to Christ. You're followers of Christ. That's exactly what it means. And that their opponents gave them that name, and they thought, well, we'll adopt it. That's fine. You can call us that. It's like Baptists didn't first call themselves Baptists as such. The Church of England mainly and other opponents would call them Baptists. Starting out as Anabaptists, they baptized again those that the Church of England considered to have already been baptized as babies, properly baptized as babies. And now they're baptizing them again as adult Anabaptists, and then they just drop the Ana and they emphasize they're baptizing believers, adults. And they're baptizing adults by immersion. So the emphasis was on immersion, yes, but I think it was mostly because of the fact that we're baptizing, again, those that had been considered baptized by the Church of England. Now, it wasn't true baptism, and they knew it, and that's why they were glad to take that moniker. It wasn't something they took to them, that they came up with. It was hurled at them, and they just accepted, because they would often be called in derision, Anabaptists, you're baptizing again. They would say technically, no, we're not baptizing again. We're baptizing for the first time. Well, when you drop the Ana and just say you're Baptist, yeah, we baptize people. So they accepted it. And as I've mentioned before, Brother Seisman's work, I think amply documents that in fact a number of those congregations, I don't know if all of them, but a number of those congregations that were later willing to call themselves Baptists because their opponents hurled the charge at them, you're Baptists, that to begin with, they had called themselves the Church of Christ. I mean, that's documented according to the minutes of their meetings. These are primary sources. Also, because their enemies, some of their enemies like bishops in the Church of England who had tackled them and tried to take them on and argue with them, said that's what they called themselves. How dare they think of themselves as the Church of Christ? Think they're the only ones going to heaven. See, the Anglicans were saying that nonsense back then. So that's what apparently happened. So what started out as a Bible-believing church that was actually fairly well obedient to the gospel plan. I know from the minutes of their meeting and other discussions in their sermons, they knew the difference in the covenants. They were not under the old covenant. They knew we're not. We're under the New Testament. And they stayed with that as the rule of practice. That was a major interpretive breakthrough. And that cleared away a lot of rubbish that had accumulated over the centuries in theology. They were able to go right straight to the source, which is the New Testament. They did all those things. They had even the right name, and they would, of course, in the day, there was no issue with the instrument because nobody used the instrument but the Catholics. You wouldn't find any non-Catholic using the instrument. Well, maybe the High Church, maybe the Anglicans did, but it was a Catholic thing. The instrument was, and everybody else just sang a cappella. They knew that was what was authorized. So that was not an issue either. So on that count, they were just as we are. They prayed, they gave their means. And then, as I've said a number of times, I'm just going back over what I've repeated from Brother Seisman's research. The Calvinists came in, especially out of Geneva, Switzerland. There were Calvinists, of course, there in England, and they were more and more influential. Scotland was just filled with Calvinists. They were all over Scotland. How, I don't know, because the Scottish are pretty smart people, but anyway, it was filled with the Calvinists. In fact, the Church of Scotland, became the Presbyterian Church. That's where it grew out of, is that Scotland and all the Calvinists there. So we're saying all that to say what we know today as the Baptists of our time, and there are many varieties of them, basically go back to that period of time and to those corruptions of a really good restoration movement that had taken place in England and about, well, the 16th century in particular in that period of time. Chris?
And just the irony of the fact that the group that continue to use that moniker don't actually think baptism is a requirement.
Right.
And the Church of Christ absolutely does. So.
Yeah, that is ironic in a way, in that you would think they would describe us that way. Hey, happy Mother's Day, everybody, by the way. Good to see you, Ben. We were just talking about Acts 11 and a number of people who at the city of Antioch were called Christians, followers of Christ. Christian, literally from the word Christ, I-A-N in English, and it means one belonging to Christ, one who pertains to Christ, a Christian. They were called Christians. So once again, I return back to my original observation that some would say this was derisively used, but I think not. I think the book of Isaiah indicates for us in the latter section, what is it, chapter 66, that God's people one day would be called by a new name, which the Lord himself would name. And I believe that this was authorized by God himself. So I don't know that it was just like in the case we talked about how Baptists now use that name, although it was first thrown at them by their opponents who didn't agree with them. And it is said, well, the Jewish opponents didn't agree with the Christians, so they threw that name at them as an insult, but they took it on and said, we're not insulted, we like it. I think better it is that it was an authorized name. Verse 27, now in those days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. Remember again the geography. On a map, they went up, if you're thinking of north and south, but Jerusalem is much higher in elevation, so topographically on the earth's surface, they went down to go to Antioch. They came down to Antioch, and one of them named Agabus. We have the name of this prophet in the church, Agabus. He stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. Luke says that's what he said and predicted, and then Luke says this took place in the days of Claudius. Claudius, the emperor of Rome. I preached a sermon in the past. I may revise some of the aspects. I'll look at the text again in the future in a different light that talked about how the churches had rest. That's going to come up here. Well, we read that. Actually, we read that, I think, a couple of weeks ago. During this period of time when Paul left them after the persecution, after the time of Stephen, Paul goes up and he's in Tarsus area. He's away. And so there's peace in the churches. There's rest in the church. Come right in, y'all. Good to see you. And while in the churches there, in that rest, they're under the period of Claudius. Now, Claudius gave fits to the Jews. I mean, the Jews, those who remain Jews. The Jews are being persecuted by the Romans in a big way under this time. And that's why some think the churches had rest, because the Jews didn't have time to go after the Christians and give them trouble. They were looking out for their own hides because Claudius gave them all kinds of trouble. Anyway, after that period of time, there was rest, but there was a great famine over all the world. So the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. Now, this is a big deal. It looks like just an incidental remark here, but it fits into a number of things said in the epistles of Paul, for example, later, as in 2 Corinthians and in other places. He will talk about how they gathered together and how he was a part of this relief effort, actual money for benevolent work, and especially how they took that money to Judea. They took it to the churches in Jerusalem. They took it to the Jerusalem church because the famine hit hard that part of the world. They suffered more than in other places, evidently. Not only did it hit hard in Judea, and was there a lot of poverty, a lot of hunger during this period of time, it was known, of course, and this was prophesied also in the Old Testament, that the Gentiles would bring their riches unto the Jews. So many have thought this is fulfillment of some of those prophecies, how the Gentiles would bring riches of the world to the Jews because they gathered around the Gentile world money and sent it down as a relief fund for the famine-stricken area of Judea. So there's something to that as well. This is going to figure in quite a bit. So we see this now. It may look like an incidental remark, but it's going to figure in to many parts of the New Testament interpretation. And they did so. So they sent that relief to the brothers living in Judea. They sent it how? Well, they sent it first to the elders. So now we see elders are in Jerusalem, right? The Jerusalem church has elders. Hey, come right in. By the hand of Barnabas and Saul. So Barnabas and Saul go back down to that area. So Barnabas, the good man, and Saul, the new convert, the one that had been greatly feared because he had been a persecutor of the church and now he's converted. They go down there and they take this money. Now, we have this awful event that's going to take place. It's not going to be total reprieve for the church here. About that time, it doesn't specify precisely when, but it's about that same general period. Chapter 12, verse 1, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, one of the prominent apostles mentioned, of course, in the narrative in the Gospels about Jesus' ministry. He killed him with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, really? I don't know why that strikes me, but it shouldn't surprise us knowing all the rest of the history. Here's Herod, not really a good friend of the Jews. He's given them a lot of grief too. But when they see he's going to attack a fellow Jew who happens to be a Christian and they despise the Christians more than anyone else, then they're delighted to see it. Yeah, go get them, Herod. Go get those Christians. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, well, he wants more accolades. See, they said, oh, what a wonderful guy. Here he is killing these Christians. So he proceeded to arrest Peter also. So Peter's very prominent. And they're going to be happy to know one of their prominent spokesmen for the early church is now arrested by the authorities. This was during the days of unleavened bread, one of the Jewish holidays. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him. Wow. They thought that these early Christians would be like Muslims and use force to come and free one of their own. That's not the way Christians operate, never have. That's the way the desert Saracens operate and always have, because it's what they learned from their pagan forefathers who raided caravans, and they just continued to do so and hallowed it with the will of Allah, as they allege Allah spoke to them. No, nothing like that. Completely different from the Islamic approach. But Herod thought they might, or somebody might, so he gave 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. So it was not the opportune moment to deal with him publicly yet, but this was going to happen as soon as Passover ends. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. Now, we know this is a miraculous era where some were prophets and apostles and they could lay hands on others, and they could heal miraculously and so on. So we might assume that that was a part of what's going to transpire. I don't think we're justified in saying that explains what's going to take place. What's going to take place is the result of what? They are earnestly praying for him. What are they praying? What is the early church praying? Now, I'm going to open this up. This is a class discussion because there are probably a number of guesses that would be close to right. I think they might have been praying for several things. What might they have been praying for when they found out their hero, Peter, was put in prison? For his safety. All right. Okay. What else might they be praying for? Suppose the Lord's will was for Peter to die like James. What may they have prayed for? Well, if they assumed that he was going to die like James, that's safety, his life, his freedom. What might they have prayed on his behalf if he's going to die?
Swift and peaceful death.
Yeah, that it not be too painful. What else? We're talking about Peter. Now, Peter has a history. and of course, this is a changed man. He's totally transformed. But he had a history. He was on the hot seat before, and it was just because some girls who happened to see him, some young maidens and some others in the courtyard, and said, hey, you were with this man that's on trial. And he cursed. He used cuss words. I don't know the man. Remember all that? Later on, he came to himself and went out and wept bitterly. After that, he was a changed man. He never did that sort of thing. But here, they probably were praying, Lord, give him boldness, give him strength, not to recant, to stand. Wouldn't we pray for that sort of thing? If some of our own were put in prison? There's a 78-year, I believe is a Scottish minister. He made the mistake in the UK some time back of having an outdoor worship service within the restricted zone of an abortion clinic. Now he said, we were careful not to mention that A word. We never mentioned abortion. We never dealt with it, but they talked about God. See, that's a crime in the UK now, a secularist country that's owned by the Muslims. It's a Muslim-controlled secularist nation. The secularists will be wiped out and the Muslims will take over if the change does not come quickly. It's just a matter of time before the Saracens have all of the UK. But anyway, this old man was convicted and he's, I guess, going to do jail time. 78 years old. Said, I've never been in trouble with the law before. But he said, they are going to put me in jail or fine him, at least hugely fine him or put him on probation because he dared to have a worship service within is it 600 yards, I think, in the UK of the entrance to an abortion mill where they murder babies at the behest of the government. You know, the government allows it. The weak-kneed liberal government composed of a coalition of a bunch of weak-kneed pantywaists, basically hardly any real men left there, a few. Oh, there's some. Is it Robinson? Is it Tommy Robinson? People, but he's always in jail. He's in jail most of the time because he speaks out and he says they're weak-kneed and they're pantywaists. We would be in jail too if we were still under British rule, but thankfully we're not. That's one of the reasons we're not, because of the way they act. So people would probably pray for that older gentleman in the UK, and I think he's from Scotland, that Scottish accent, that he be strong, that he's able to bear up under the persecution of the British government, persecution by a secularist government that's basically become a bunch of Fabian socialists / Marxists, lightweight Marxists. That's what they are, just lightweight Marxists. Anyway, they probably prayed all that. And this is a conjecture. I opened up to the class, and all these answers are probably close to right. But they probably, too, were praying for his release. The reason we say that is because God's going to answer the prayer, and they can't believe it happened. It's like they're praying that he be released, but if you ask them on the side, how likely do you think that is? Well, what happened to James? They didn't let him go. He was killed by the edge of the sword. What do you think is going to happen to Peter when the Passover ends? What is he going to do? Herod's going to, oh, it's bad. Why do you think he's going to get out of this one? Oh, but we've prayed. We've prayed. Let's see what it says in verse 6. Now, when Herod was about to bring him out on that very night, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Dress yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." What does Peter think? We know what the verses later will tell us what Peter's thinking. This is a pleasant dream. He's thinking, wow, this is a great dream. That's what he's thinking. But it's not a dream. And he went out and followed him. He did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. In other words, a vision or a dream. When they had passed the first and the second guard, they came to the iron gate leading into the city. It opened for them of its own accord. Can't you hear that creaky gate? I mean, just you can imagine all this. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel left him. When Peter came to himself, that phrase is used more than once in the Bible, isn't it? Like the prodigal son, means he's in his right mind. All along he thinks, yeah, this is a great dream. He thinks he's being led in a vision. But now he realizes it's real. One of the points I have made about this over the years, some may think it's goofy to make it, but I believe it's fair. You can tell me what you think. Is that, in our age, we've just passed through an era back in the 90s, and it's still with us. They still call it critical theory, critical race theory, critical sex theory, all kinds of critical theory. But it used to be called postmodernism, critical theory, the postmodern. Anyway, these postmodernists denied we can differentiate between reality, objective reality, out there reality, and whatever's in our own minds. So they were very much like the Berkeleyan idealists of one time. These were philosophers. Berkeley was a philosopher who said, the world's not real out there. It's just a projection of our thoughts. You know, like I'm really a butterfly dreaming I'm a man. You've heard the Japanese poem. So I'm not really a man. I just dream that I am. Well, that kind of perspectivalism has been destructive of science. It has destroyed the history department, and it especially destroys Bible studies. And that's what they want. They were a bunch of homosexual Marxists, mostly from France, and some of them ex-Nazis, who came up with critical theory to start with historically. And we're just tracing the history of the great shakers and movers behind the postmodernist movement and their perspectival views, their conceptual ideas that there is no reality out there. So that's why I say it's terrible for science. They hated scientists, everything's mystical and feely, touchy, and so on. And they absolutely repudiate any objective world. In the biblical outlook, there is a world of visions that's in the mind, and then there's a real world. Where did Peter end up? In the real streets outside the prison. So the Bible does not endorse that nonsense, that lunacy of the Marxists of our time, the neo-Marxists of our time, and the critical theorists, as they're called. So we look down here and we see that he came to himself. He said, now I'm sure, this is verse 11, that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. Oh, that's anti-Semitic, they would say today, for Luke to describe it that way, that the Jews were expecting, but they were. The Jews were glad when James was killed, right? The Jews liked to see Christians suffer. That's what they wanted to do. That's what they wanted to happen. So he was rescued from Herod and from all the Jewish people, what they were expecting to happen. They were waiting for Peter to be killed. Now, this is an answer to prayer. So the brethren have been praying earnestly about this. Come in, y'all. So look at verse 12. When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. Ooh, who's this guy? John Mark. How do we know about him? He may have been the young man who fled naked in the garden on the night of Jesus' arrest. We know he was a protege later of Paul, and then finally perhaps of Peter himself, maybe in Rome, and is the author of the gospel that bears his name, Mark, the Gospel of Mark. So he evidently was from a prominent family in Jerusalem. Why? Well, they had a house big enough for a lot of people to be in praying. That's how we infer that. It's just a nice house. Maybe that's where the church met, in Jerusalem. They were gathered together and they were praying. Now, what have they been praying for? Luke just told us they're praying for Peter. We said his safety, his boldness, and so on. So they're praying that God would rescue him. And when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda, look at all the details that are provided here. This is not just some legend. It's details that Luke himself had researched carefully. Her name was Rhoda. She's a servant girl, but her name will forever be remembered. She came to answer. Recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy, she did not open the gate. So Peter's calling, saying, Rhoda, is that you? Let me in. He may have known. So, this is Peter. Let me in. So why not open the gate? Well, she's afraid. So she goes running back. So she didn't open the gate as you would expect, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. They said to her, you're out of your mind. Yes, you are out of your mind. We have two occasions. Earlier, Peter thought he was out of his mind when he was rescued, but no, he came to himself. I'm not out of my mind. I'm out of jail. But now they say, you're out of your mind. But what have you been praying for? Yeah, but we didn't think God would really answer. But she kept insisting that it was so. And they kept saying, it is his angel. Now, but Peter continued knocking. You hear all this time this discussion is going on. Somebody open the door. I mean, Peter keeps knocking on the door and they're discussing. This is not Peter. Well, who could it be? What does this tell us about their beliefs, right or wrong?
Not very strong at all, was it?
Well, not about prayer, but what does it tell us about their belief about angels and people?
Oh, yeah. It's got to be his angel. Yeah.
They must have thought maybe Peter had been killed in the prison or something, and now his angel is coming to the door. We don't have that concept. It's not elaborated that I know of. They come in anywhere else in Scripture that I know of that there are angels like that. But this was their view. So it's not a real person. It's not really Peter. Again, we have Luke talking about reality, perception versus reality. You just perceived it as Peter. It's really his angel. But he kept knocking. So they finally decided to open. And when they opened, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord, I mean, can't you imagine the emotion, all the commotion going on? He described to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, tell these things to James and to the brothers. Now, that's not the one that was killed. That's James, the brother of the Lord. Then he departed and went to another place. So we'll have to stop there at the end of verse 17. But I just find this fascinating, hard to stop right in the middle of this. But it's so human-like, isn't it? I mean, everything described is just what we know of ourselves, even though it's way over 2,000 years since those events. And we have every reason to believe that these things actually happened. Any questions or any comments? All right, y'all, let's take a few minutes break.